Hi, my name is Jeremy Davis. I'm the Head of Communications at the Fatherhood Institute. On May the 25th of this year, George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, was killed by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota, during an arrest for allegedly using a fake $20 note in a shop. He leaves behind a daughter of 6. During the arrest, Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, knelt on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes while he was handcuffed and lying face down in the street, begging for his life and repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." A second and third officer further restrained Floyd, while a fourth prevented bystanders from intervening. All 4 officers were fired the following day after videos made by witnesses and security cameras became public. 2 autopsies found Floyd's death to be a homicide, and the event has triggered demonstrations and protests in more than 75 US cities and around the world, including in London, Bristol and Manchester. In the wake of the protest, Neville Lawrence, father of Stephen, whose murder in 1993 by a racist gang in southeast London and subsequent bungled police investigation led to a public inquiry that identified institutional racism in the police, said that black people are still treated as second-class citizens in Britain. Today, I'm joined by Cassius Campbell, a London-based counsellor who helps clients with problems ranging from anger and bereavement to depression and workplace stress. Cassius is lead student counsellor at Roehampton University. He also works with the Fatherhood Institute, training family professionals in how to work effectively with dads, and is himself a father of 3 boys. We're here to chat about the George Floyd case, Cassius's own experiences, and to think about what support black fathers might need. So, hi Cassius.
Good morning, Jeremy.
I suppose I'd like to start by asking you what conversations you're having with your own boys about George Floyd's death and the global response to it.
Well, conversations have been really in depth, and I've got 3 boys that you've mentioned earlier on. And I suppose I think about when we have watched that video, which we have done on a few occasions, just to analyse and try and make sense of what's going on. What definitely comes up for me is my experiences of discrimination, my experiences of racism, and how it made me feel in regards to watching George Floyd on the floor. And that quite easily could have been me, it could have been one of my brothers, it could have been my father, or even my sons. And so I felt like the conversation between my boys was around what was their opinion from what they had seen, and also how did it make them feel watching that scenario play itself out. And I suppose what's really interesting as we had this conversation was about how shocked they were and how unbelievable it is that we have a police service, and the motto, I imagine, of any police service is to protect members of the community, citizens of their community. And in this regard, it seemed that those officers in particular were not protecting, but they were actually doing the opposite of that. That they were actually committing murder. And the way how it happened was that, again, something that myself and my children talked about was there were people there to witness that murder, and they were there to say, well, you need to stop, this man isn't breathing. And I suppose the most distressing part of the whole situation was, where was the compassion? Where was the empathy? Where was the positive regard for this particular person who was not resisting arrest, who was already handcuffed behind his back, and who was surrounded by 4 police officers? So I suppose what comes up is what is the stereotype around Black men in particular, and what is it that the white other sees when they see a Black person or a Black man in front of them? Is there fear? Is there a sense of being frightened? Is there a sense of retribution? It just goes on and on and on as I try to think about it, and then as I try to have that conversation with my children. Because what's really interesting in regards to this case is that that's my lived experience of witnessing that and seeing police brutality. But it hasn't been the experience of my children, because I've been the buffer between them having to experience those things and me protecting them from that kind of microaggression that can also lead to murder. So to some degree, I try to have a conversation that is evenly balanced, but also I try to have a conversation that builds on their experiences of what they may have experienced at school or with friends, or when they socialize out within their community or at their social groupings. And I suppose the conversations we have is, and this is really interesting for me, I think, one of the conversations I had when they go to social groupings is, how were you treated? And did you feel safe? And what kind of conversations and discussions did you have with those people within those social groups? And was there any sense of identifying that you may have felt left out or excluded from whatever social gathering or whatever social group you may have been in? And what's really surprising is their expressions or responses to me is, no, we've always felt we've been included in that. We've always felt that we've been part of whatever discussion or whatever group they've been involved in. And I suppose that's a benefit to me as a father, and also a benefit to their mother as well, in regards to that we've been able to protect them and give them a sense of open-mindedness around how they engage. And it's great, I think, when we continue these conversations about George Floyd, other incidents that has happened, that we're able to have a balanced view on it, but also not to disguise the trauma that exists generationally within our family and also within the community where we live. And I suppose what I don't want this to be for them is a constant preoccupation that leaves them in a sense of paralysis, where they're unable to shift, unable to travel, unable to move because of the fears that I may have imparted onto them. So I've got to be really careful about how I have these conversations. And they need to be balanced, they need to be somewhat democratic, but also with a sense of knowing that history is very fluid. And what I may have experienced 30 years ago or 40 years ago in the 70s and the early 60s, and what my father may have experienced and my mother may have experienced when they came over in 1955 will be different to what my children experience today. Not to take away the subtleness of what may be going on, because it may not be as overt, but there may be subtleties that they may miss and I may miss myself. And I suppose it's those subtleties that I try to pin down and have conversations about.
And so how old are your boys?
Okay, my youngest boy is 14, and my middle child is 19, and my oldest child is 27.
Right. Okay. So And so, I mean, with your oldest one, for example, because I guess I could imagine that with a 14-year-old, perhaps, I don't know, there could be all sorts of reasons why a conversation with your dad about, well, anything, but, you know, let's say racism. I don't know, sometimes you might not be, you just might not want to engage with that, or you might be obsessing a little bit about, you know, you have your worldview and dad has his worldview and they don't necessarily coincide and whatever. That's teenage, I guess.
Yeah.
But so I'm asking about your oldest one, because I'm sort of thinking, okay, so he's come through all that, and he's good, you know, and his experiences are wider, and he's more independent, and so on. If you talk to him about the Floyd case, and more generally his experiences of racism, what story does he tell?
Yeah. Well, I think the story is a journey, isn't it? And when I think about when he was first born, and the dreams and expectations that we have of our children in general is broad and far-reaching, and encompassing of all things that are surrounded, that are within their environment. And what's really interesting, him being born, going to nursery, going to primary school, at those stages of his life, he's very much part and parcel of the wider societal offer that they have to offer in regards to school, in regards to engaging with teachers. Because I think at that stage, boys in particular aren't seen as a threat. They're seen as just children. And I suppose children in themselves, when they look at their friends are just their friends. There's not a sense, I think, of identifying, that's my black friend, that's my white friend, that's my Asian friend. That's Johnny, that's Amir, that's Michael, and they all can engage in living life and enjoying what life has to offer. And I think that's really interesting. I think when the change starts to happen, and I can only talk about my own experience, when the change starts to happen, and I noticed it with my son, is when he got into secondary school. And what happened then was a very clear distinction that he was a black boy.
Right.
And this was continually talked about in parents' meetings that I attended. Oh, he's a black boy. Oh, he's quite big for his age. And assumptions made about our social standing as parents, and myself as a parent. There was an assumption that we came from probably a poor background, and which is your child on free school meals, which he wasn't. You know, there's all these other things available for him.
Yes.
And when I started to evaluate and think about these things, I started to think about, one, how does this teacher visualize my son as an 11, 12-year-old? And two, how do they visualize me as a father, as a parent? You know, and I suppose there was for me, it was a conscious battle. Probably for the teacher, it was an unconscious one, because maybe intentionally they were trying to help, but I didn't think it was help. What I thought it was already these labels being attached. And I think, based on my older son's experiences, was that as soon as he got into secondary school, everything went downhill. His grades went downhill. His sense of self-esteem went downhill. And I think what's really interesting is that, which is different to his brothers, his younger brothers, is that when I asked him then, how do you see yourself? The first thing he said was, I see myself as a big black a big black guy, a big black boy. That's how he described himself.
Mm.
And I think when I look at it and I examine that, it wasn't things like, oh, I see myself as intelligent. I see myself as career-minded. I see myself as wanting to achieve great things.
Mm.
It was all about his identity, and that was something that was really being crammed down his throat continuously, both consciously and unconsciously. And I think those kind of messages, even though they may be well-intentioned, they have a huge impact on how Black children or children of visual difference see themselves, because they no longer see them, I think, they no longer see themselves in regards to having careers as a journalist or going to university or things like that. They see themselves as having to defend their identity because it's continually focused on, continually under attack, continually seen as a measuring tool. And I think that causes huge disruption to the cognitive process of how children see themselves in the present and also in the future. And luckily for my oldest son, we're quite a strong family unit, and we're very much a patriarchal in regards to, we're very much a boy or man-led family. I've got 4 brothers and I've got no sisters. And within my family, all my nephews, majority of my nephews are boys. There's only 4 girls.
Okay.
In our larger family grouping
of
26 in total, there's only 4 girls. We're very much a man-led family, and so for him to have to go through that, but also we had the provision of his granddad being there, me being there, his uncles being there. I think it provided some really good stability. And touch wood, he's doing okay. He's doing really well. And we had a discussion actually 2 days ago, and I asked him actually in reference to this discussion. I asked him, "How do you think you're doing?" And he said to me, considering how secondary school was, and it was awful for him, he said, "I think I've done okay."
Yeah.
And it was really pleasing for me to hear that, because what he's saying is he survived this path or this stage of the process, and he's done all right, and he's working, and he's earning, and he's living independently, and he's doing all the things that I would expect a young citizen to do who's born in this country, which I think is in contrast to what my parents said to me, which was, "Don't bring police to this house. Be careful as you step out of the door. If they stop and search you, don't resist." And this is my parents saying this to me as a 12-year-old. And that was the reality, actually. They were right. Because the preoccupation wasn't about learning. The preoccupation was about how different I was to the dominant culture that I lived in, and also the consequences of that if I step out of line.
So, I mean, you've raised lots of very interesting stuff in there, which I probably want to come back to. But just on this point about about stop and search, I suppose that, you know, I am a white middle-class man, and my dealings with the police have been minimal, to say the least. And it's just, you know, the police are just not a part of my consciousness, I suppose. I wonder what your experience is, and sort of, you know, has that changed? I would assume that has changed as you've got older, but maybe not. But I suppose I'm interested in the sort of how present are the police, or how present have they been in your life?
I think that's a good question. because I think for me, the most important thing, I think, for if we're talking about fatherhood and we're talking about families in relation to this interview and George Floyd and the connections to police and so on and so forth, I think the most important thing for my family in regards to the family that I was born into, my mum, my dad, and my brothers, that was our security, that was our safety. Our safety was we had a safe home. And that was something that we could always come back to. And God bless my parents, they worked day and night to ensure that that home was secure and that place was safe for us. And if anything was to go wrong, we knew that our parents were there to support us if that was the case. So in regards to engagement with the police, I'm lucky enough to say that I haven't had the experience of being handcuffed or thrown in the back of a police van or being imprisoned in anywhere, and neither has any member of my family. But what I would say to you is that the experience of stop and search is so humiliating. But I can see the benefits of it, but it needs to be intelligence-led. And I suppose when I think about my experiences of stop and search, which began from the age of 12, it really shaped my consciousness about how then do I navigate this conversation between a white police officer who assumes that I may have stolen something, or who assumes that I'm in a particular area at a particular time that I shouldn't be. And what's really interesting, Jeremy, because where we live is a place called Queen's Park. And it's always been a residential kind of upmarket area to a lesser or greater degree. It's now more upmarket now than it's ever been before. And I remember going to the park, and I was literally round the corner from my house, and a police car stopped me. And he said to me, "What are you doing in this area? What are you doing in this area?" And I thought, and my immediate response to him was, "I live round the corner." And he says, "How can your parents afford to live in this area?" So those were the kinds of conversations. And as a young boy, you're stuck and you're thinking, this is an adult grown man interrogating me just around the corner from my house and telling me that, one, what am I doing here? And two, how can my parents afford to live here? So these have a huge impact on your psyche, on your sense of self-worth, your sense of confidence. But I suppose I was able to turn it around. And the way I was able to turn things around as time went on was to actually challenge the very nature of being stopped and searched, or being followed round and round the block by a police car for whatever reason. So I was able to challenge that. And the way I was able to challenge that was by saying, you know, please, how can I help you? And they would say the normal thing, which is, there's been a burglary around the corner and you fit the description. That would be it always came out like that way. So basically what they're saying is that all black people look the same. So there's been a burglary around the corner, you fit the description. So I'd stay there, I'd be stopped and searched, and then we'd have this interface. And this interface would be me asking the officer, have you found what you've been looking for? And the officer would say, no, I haven't found what I've been looking for. I said, great. Then I would say, I feel really embarrassed that you've stopped and searched me in the middle of a high street. I'm coming home from university. I've got my suitcase. You've opened that suitcase. You've searched it. You haven't found what you're looking for. Now you're just going to walk away. I demand an apology from you. And I remember this particular police officer saying to me, oh, let's do this officially then. So he thought I was being offensive. So he tried then to assert his dominance and authority over me. And I responded by saying, we don't need to do this officially. All I want from you is an apology. And then I can go on my way and you can go on yours. And eventually he said sorry. And I said to him, thank you very much. And then I left. So those are some incidences that have happened where I've been able to advocate really well what was going on. And again, provide no resistance to that. And really be open and transparent. But unfortunately, I have friends who have suffered because of those interactions, because they probably haven't had the vocabulary, they probably haven't had the support of family, they probably haven't had the reassurance, the internal reassurance that they needed in order to engage confidently with authority.
Yeah.
And as a direct result of that, they've ended up in the criminal justice system, and that makes me really sad. And I think you have some statistics around the percentage of Black men who are incarcerated. And I strongly believe a lot of those incarcerations happen because of that interface, which then gets nasty, which then creates a situation that we saw with George Floyd, where police officers, for some reason, highlight a threat, and I'm not quite sure what that threat could be, and then they feel the need to use excessive force to quench that threat, and then it can lead to huge catastrophes that we have seen, and that we also see in the UK around deaths in custody and around prison incarceration.
I'm just going to share the screen at this point, because I've put together some figures on various aspects of so yeah, criminal justice. So I mean, these figures are pretty stark. Black people are 9 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched, 3 times as likely to be arrested, 5 times as likely to have force used against them. This is in the UK.
Yeah. And what's interesting, Jeremy, is that these statistics are police statistics.
Yeah.
So they can't be denied. And what I think is really interesting is when there are demonstrations, when there are protests, when there are people who stick their head above the parapet and say, this is what's going on in our community, we feel oppressed. And then we have an MP or the chief of police saying, well, you know, we need to do this because this is important, because you know, there's high rates of violence or criminality going on in this area. And that may be true. And I'm not going to deny that. There may be grains of truth to that. But I'd like to know, out of the 9 times of Black people that are stopped and searched and humiliated on the street, how many of those lead actually to an arrest or to a criminal conviction? And I can guarantee you that it's very few. And the reasons why is because it's not intelligence-led stop and search. Stop and search are random. It's based on terror stereotypes, and it's based on assumption. And hence why it's so high, because they stop people because of the color of their skins. And the police are fearful of admitting that, and that's a shame, really, because I think if once that is brought to light as being the truth, then we can look at building communities who can support the police in ensuring that their communities stay safe. As long as the statistics remain the same as you have highlighted really well in points 1, 2, and 3, how can the community then trust a police service that polices by consent? How can people trust that police service if they know that them themselves can be the next George Floyd or the next statistic? You know, it's shocking. It's really shocking.
It is. I'm thinking at this point I might just flick through these slides that I've put together, because obviously, you know, the crux of what we've been talking about is relations with the police. But in preparing for this conversation, I thought, well, you know, okay, addressing my own assumptions, I suppose, I thought, well, in order to tell this story, we need to look at some of the kind of the context of, you know, like as a black dad in Britain in 2020, what's your context, you know, compared to your white equivalent? So I thought, okay, there are various things I wanted to look at. So. Just so looking at economics, which is a fairly obvious one, 9% of black people are unemployed,
Yeah.
so 4% of the general population.
Yeah.
Black employees earn 9% less than white employees.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one for me, because I suppose at the Fatherhood Institute, we spend a lot of energy thinking about the gender pay gap, which is bigger than that, more like sort of 18%, I think.
Yeah.
But you know, this is a significant pay gap.
Yes.
You know?
And when we compare it in regards to the black population in this country, it's a huge percentage in regards to the population. And I think, again, it highlights so many inequalities that exist within our society. And I think it also highlights how we think about the Race Relations Amendment Act. We think about the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which put in place particular guidelines, particular legal documents that are meant to protect against these sorts of statistics.
Yeah.
But also we need to bear in mind, Jeremy, that these documents, these guidelines, these legal documents are only as powerful as the people who are prepared to put them into action.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I think about line managers, I think about principals, I think about counsellors of universities, I think about the head of the police service, Cressida Dick. These are the people who should be really taking a lead in ensuring that these legal documents really have teeth and really say what they say on the tin, really, and demonstrate that. But unfortunately, I think what happens is that when we look at these statistics, and if we think about the population of black people in this country, which I think is something between 3 and 4 million people who are black or visual difference in this country, it's just a drop in the ocean, isn't it? Yeah. And when you think about the dominant culture, the dominant white culture, why should I, if I was a heterosexual white male, if we're going to think about that being the dominant power structure within the UK, why should I be interested in the economics of black people, and why should I want to give up my power and my sense of privilege for someone else who I think may be a competitor in regards to the job market, in regards to the education market, in regards to the housing market, in regards to good healthcare? Because if we're thinking about equality, we're thinking about equality being there. And I think about this all the time, and it's quite understandable why these structures stay in place. It's quite understandable why the status quo stays in place, because it keeps a certain hierarchy in place that controls how we live. And you talked earlier on about being a white male, and yes, I see that. But I also understand, I really do understand my own power as a black heterosexual middle class man over a white woman maybe, or over someone who's disabled, or over someone who may be a new refugee into the country. Because I have my power there as well, don't I, in regards to how I then use that. And what I try to do, I'm always mindful of that power. I'm always mindful of how can I help and support somebody else to ensure that they get their sense of equality. And I remember, sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a very important point, and it's and it speaks to your experience. You through the school of hard knocks, let's call it, have been put in a position where you have a good level of awareness and understanding of your privilege where it exists, and also the opposite of that, I guess. But you know that has you've had no choice but to acknowledge that and to come up with some sort of response to it. I guess maybe what I think what's interesting to me with the response to the George Floyd case and the whole kind of Black Lives Matter movement, and I don't know, always when these things happen, it's tempting in the early period of it to feel like, you know, oh, this one's different and this has caught the mood and whatever. But it does feel at this stage in proceedings as if, unusually, I'm seeing the privileged acknowledging their privilege and talking about the need to take action more than I've seen before in similar cases. But what I'm not talking here about the politicians necessarily. I'm talking about, you know, on social media, in the popular narrative feels as if it's searching for constructive action.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
We pull down a statue.
Yes.
We change the curriculum.
Yes.
We read, you know, what books should I be reading? How should I be talking about this with my children? It feels like that is starting to happen.
And I think it's long overdue, because I think when I think about education, when I think about social responsibility, when I think about employment, when I think about healthcare, when I think about mental health services, people of visual difference are starting way back. If we think about, you know, a track and field event against, you know, white people are probably 400 meters or so way ahead before we even actually get the starting gun going. So I feel like there's always a sense of playing catch up. There's always a sense of playing catch up to try and fulfill these obligations as a good citizen. And I suppose when I think about what's happening now, I think together, and I base that all on the protected characteristics that we hold dear in this country, which is democracy, which is about reconstructing the whole system that we have here, because we can see that it's unequal. And together, if we reconstruct it, then we can have hope for the future. And I think that's really important. But I think what's also interesting, when I think about the great speakers of the past and the great speakers of the present, there tends to be this momentum that happens, like you were alluding to. And I think those momentums are good. And then all of a sudden, they kind of like filter out.
Yeah.
And what I want to do, or what I feel should happen, is that there needs to be this sense of that this movement doesn't filter out, but it stays ever evolving and getting larger and larger as more people jump on board to readdress the imbalances that we see in our society right across the board. And I think that's what we're talking about when we talk about true democracy. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about protected characteristics. We're talking about everybody being involved, everybody being part of this, everybody moving together. And you know, I don't hear a lot of our leaders, and by leaders I mean the people who are meant to take responsibility. I don't see many of them saying that, and if they do say it, they don't act on it, which I think is a shame.
So the slide I've got up now, I've put up because I suppose my focus in putting these slides together has been to explore stuff that is, you know, directly relevant to Black men who are fathers. And you know, a bunch of this, to differing degrees, would be true of fathers of other ethnicities too, other than white. I suppose I've kept the focus very much on, you know, Black, because, you know, that's what we're talking about. With the George Floyd case was that, and there is this big, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not to exclude other ethnicities, but you know, you need to start somewhere and deal with. You know, these are some of the deepest kind of inequalities, I suppose, in our society. I mean, this first statistic here, now this one's been around for a while. You know, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy than women.
So what's interesting here, Jeremy, is if I can just pop in a word there. My mother was a nurse for 30 years within the NHS. And I remember her used to talk about this years and years ago in regards to how she observed Black women in pregnancy being treated by white nurses. And I think, again, these statistics are no surprise to me, or they're not a surprise to any person who comes from the Black community, Black or Asian community, or visual different community, because I think this has been around for such a long time. And it's interesting what has come up from the report of this around the assumption that Black women can take more pain or can absorb more pain than their white counterparts. So that sense of giving pain relief wasn't an immediate thought. And again, these things are shocking when we think about what is going on in the minds, in the cognitive process of people who see difference. So, you know, this very much lends itself to we can no longer visualize a racist or someone who has hatred written all over their faces, because we used to see them in the 70s. They wore Dr. Martin boots with 24 holes in them and bleached jeans, and they had tattoos all over their faces with skinned heads. And we could see them. They were very visible to us. But in the society we live now, it's so complex in regards to how this cognitive process can manifest itself. And I think it's a shame that we have to look. It makes me, I feel ashamed looking at these statistics. I feel actually sad about it.
Absolutely. Me too. And I mean, I've thrown in some figures there about COVID-19 too, and its disproportionate effect. And obviously there's been a lot in the press about that. And again, perhaps one can hope that, the impact of the virus on kind of illuminating inequalities, we can hope perhaps that will translate into action.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps what's most interesting is the sort of the coincidence, if you like, of the George Floyd case with the coronavirus story. Speaking for the Fatherhood Institute, when I look at these figures and this conversation that we're having today, what it makes me think is that, we as an organisation, there is stuff that we could be doing that would respond to both of those kind of crises, if you like, and perhaps form part of making the world a better place. Yeah. An example being, as well as finding the figure that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy. I did a quick search yesterday of the research evidence on. I wanted to see, okay, so this figure, I knew this figure, I knew it had been around for a while. I thought, okay, so I want to see what's being done about that. And I found a very high quality research paper that was done a few years ago, which was looking for interventions, health service interventions aimed at solving that problem, the disproportionate deaths among Black mothers. Mm. And it found very, 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 very few.
Yeah.
I think it was 5 interventions.
Yeah.
And of course, those interventions were of different scale and different quality and so on. So as well as knowing that this is an issue, we also know for sure that not much is being done about it.
Yeah.
And so it feels to me like there's a lot of scope. If you change your view slightly, if you stop looking like that and you look like that instead, it's not difficult actually to find ways of doing things differently.
Yeah.
Or refocusing what you do in a way that might serve the needs of Black people better than what we have now.
Yes. Because I think when I look at those statistics, what I think is there's been a basic lack of care. There's been a basic lack of duty of care to those individuals, hence why the statistics are so high. And I suppose those are the conversations that need to be had, and those are the things that need to be highlighted, and also have a task force on hand to address those issues, because they have far-reaching consequences. And the far-reaching consequences they have are for the children of those individuals.
Exactly.
Who go into COVID-19 and it's a risk and they haven't got PPE. Mothers who die at birth and leave children and probably other children that they may have had before, or their partners behind. All these things have a real generational impact, as well as a deep impact of loss. And how does one come to terms with that when that's happened? How do you get over that and not feel that you've been mistreated in some way or you've been treated unfairly? Mm-hmm. And then when the common denominator comes down, when you try to figure things out, this is what I tried to do. And I remember I used to go crazy doing this. I used to figure out, what is it about me? So I made myself the problem. What is it about me that makes people upset, angry, or whatever it may be? And I used to go crazy thinking about these things. And then the last thing I could come down to was, it must be about my ethnicity, because I can't think of anything else.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people, that's what it comes down to. And the thing is, you cannot change your ethnicity. You are who you are. And to think that will be a barrier to good healthcare, to good housing, to good education. It's a horrid thought. It's a horrid thought indeed.
Yeah, and difficult as a father, I guess, to I mean, you know, and we've talked about this before. You have a job to do as regards sending your children out into the world that I don't have, you know, because I'm white. I mean, I guess you could say, okay, I and maybe this is part of what people like me should be learning from all of this, is that actually we have a job to do as well, which is to prepare our children to understand your lived experience and make the changes and take responsibility for making the changes necessary.
Yes. And I think that responsibility, the collective responsibility, as well as an individual responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's for everyone. You know, this isn't just an isolated incident. It's not just an isolated case. These cases are going on all over the country. And I suppose we are talking from a Black perspective, and I understand that, and I want to keep true to that. But from working all over the UK, I know that class also has something to do with it. And again, that's my experience and my awareness of how class can really impact on people's education, health, and housing. And those are the three things that are so important for upward mobility. And if those things are not in place, then people feel in a generational cycle of despair. And I suppose when I think about that generational cycle of despair, that's very much what I see in sections of the Black community, in sections of the Asian community, in sections of the Chinese community, you know, and also in sections of the white community as well. I see that those generations of despair, and I think there needs to be a sense of standing up and addressing those issues, because there's enough for everybody. There's enough wealth and resources for everyone to share and be part of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's a nice message to finish on, I think. And I want to thank you for making this conversation happen. And yeah, well, we will continue talking. And I think, as I was saying earlier, I think, you know, there is stuff that all of us can and should be doing to equalise our society, and the Fatherhood Institute is no exception to that. And I look forward to working with you on that, and coming up with ways of supporting Black fathers.
Yes. And I want to echo that, Jeremy. I think it's been a useful conversation today, and I'm hoping the points that have been raised here will resonate with people who may watch this particular podcast. But also, I think that what happens when change happens with one group, it then meanders out to other groups, and they can also see avenues for change as well. So this is just a catalyst to improve and move on for other people, as well as the group that we've been discussing today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Cassius. And I'm not going to ask you to play us out with a piece on your lovely. Maybe that's for future conversation.
Definitely, that sounds great. Thank you very
Okay.
much, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Cassius.
Bye.
Bye.